On a stormy autumn night, 72-year-old widow Margaret Wilson rescued a tiny, soaking wet kitten from a storm drain near her farmhouse. She named him Storm and devoted herself to his care. As months passed, Margaret noticed peculiar changes, strange patterns appearing on his coat, his growing size, and the way neighboring animals kept their distance. When veterinarian Dr. James Reyes caught a glimpse through her window, his expression suddenly transformed into pure shock. Life had grown quiet for Margaret Wilson after her husband passed away. The 72-year-old widow rarely had company in her old farmhouse that sat at the edge of a dense forest. Her children had moved to the city for better opportunities years ago, leaving her with nothing but memories and the occasional phone call to fill her days. The changing seasons marked time for Margaret as she tended her garden and kept up with her simple routines. Her neighbors were kind but distant, separated by acres of land. Most days passed in complete silence, except for the sounds of nature and the creaking of her old farmhouse. That autumn had been particularly lonely. The days grew shorter and the storms more frequent. Margaret found herself listening to the rain at night, wondering how many more seasons she would witness alone. On a particularly violent autumn evening, the wind howled against her windows as rain pounded the roof. Margaret sat in her living room with a cup of tea when she heard something unusual over the storm's fury. A faint crying sound came from somewhere outside. At first, Margaret thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a high-pitched mewling that cut through the storm's noise. Despite the weather, Margaret grabbed her raincoat and flashlight. She stepped out onto her porch, listening carefully as the rain soaked her shoes. The crying led her toward the edge of her property, where a small drainage ditch carried runoff from the road. Margaret shined her light down into the rushing water and gasped. There, clinging to a small piece of debris, was a tiny kitten, soaked to the bone and barely keeping its head above water. Without hesitation, Margaret lowered herself carefully down the slippery embankment. The cold rain pelted her face as she reached for the trembling creature. Its cries were growing weaker by the second. With careful movements, she scooped the kitten into her hands and felt how terribly cold it was. The poor thing's eyes weren't even fully open yet. Back inside her warm kitchen, Margaret worked quickly. She dried the kitten with soft towels, noting how its tiny body shivered uncontrollably. The kitten could hardly move, so Margaret prepared a mixture of warm milk using a small dropper as she'd done years ago with orphan farm kittens. Throughout the night, Margaret set her alarm every 2 hours to feed and check on her tiny charge. By morning, she was exhausted but relieved to see the kitten still breathing. Its condition remained precarious, though, and Margaret knew she needed professional help. The local veterinarian examined the kitten with a grave expression. He explained to Margaret that abandoned kittens this young rarely survived without their mothers. The odds were stacked against this little one, especially after exposure to such harsh elements. Margaret listened, but had already made up her mind. She was going to give this kitten every chance at life. Margaret created a warm nesting box and diligently followed the vet's instructions for hand-raising an orphan kitten. She named him Storm, a fitting tribute to the night that brought them together. Every few hours, she fed him special formula, helped him eliminate waste, and checked his temperature. The first week passed in a blur of worry and small victories. Against the odds, Storm began to thrive under Margaret's constant care. His strength improved daily, and soon his eyes opened fully, revealing striking amber irises that seemed to glow in certain light. Margaret noticed unusual markings beginning to develop on his coat, beautiful rosette patterns unlike any house cat she'd seen before. When she mentioned these distinctive markings during Storm's follow-up appointment, the veterinarian suggested he might be some exotic mixed breed. He also noted Storm's unusually large paws, but assured Margaret that some cats simply grew into them eventually. Margaret accepted this explanation, focusing instead on her gratitude that Storm was alive and growing. As the weeks turned to months, Margaret found herself talking to Storm throughout the day. She told him about her late husband, her children in the city, and the quiet life she'd grown accustomed to. Storm would watch her with those intense eyes, seeming to understand every word. For the first time in years, Margaret's home felt alive again. The loneliness that had been her constant companion began to fade. Margaret woke each morning with purpose, delighting in Storm's playful antics and watching him explore his surroundings with growing confidence. She took countless photos to share with her children during their rare visits, proudly displaying Storm's growth like a grandmother with a new grandchild. Neighbors who occasionally stopped by to check on Margaret began to comment on her unusual pet. Some seemed uneasy around Storm, making excuses not to stay long. Margaret attributed their behavior to simple pet preferences. Not everyone was a cat person after all, but she did notice fewer visitors as time went on. By the time Storm reached 6 months, something unexpected was happening. While most kittens would have reached their adult size, Storm showed no signs of stopping his growth. He had already reached the size of a full-grown house cat and continued to develop muscular shoulders and powerful legs. His voice changed too. The sweet meows of kittenhood deepened into strange, throaty sounds that sometimes startled Margaret in the night. His movements became increasingly powerful and precise. Storm could leap effortlessly to the top of her tallest bookcase, landing without making a sound. Margaret also began to notice how the local wildlife reacted to Storm's presence. The neighborhood cats that once wandered freely near her property no longer came around. Even more peculiar was Storm's reaction to the deer that occasionally grazed in her backyard. He would flatten himself against the window, his body tense with a focus that seemed almost predatory. Margaret started researching large domestic cat breeds online at the local library. Perhaps Storm was part Maine Coon or Norwegian forest cat, breeds known for their impressive size. Yet when she compared photos to Storm's increasingly distinctive appearance, nothing quite matched. His rosette markings had become more pronounced, and his face was developing a shape unlike any domestic cat she'd seen. At 8 months, Storm had grown to the size of a medium dog. His shoulders were powerful, his eyes intensely focused, and his movements had a wild grace that both mesmerized and occasionally concerned Margaret. He remained affectionate with her, but displayed an increasing restlessness, particularly at night when he would pace by the windows. Margaret began to notice small damages around the house, scratches on furniture that were deeper than normal cat claws should make, and door frames with gouges from what appeared to be Storm testing his strength. Though she never felt threatened, Margaret sometimes caught herself wondering what was happening with her beloved rescue. When Dr. James Reyes, a wildlife biologist, came to study the local forest ecosystem, Margaret's quiet life took another unexpected turn. The scientist had been collecting samples near her property when he happened to glance through her kitchen window. Margaret was inside preparing lunch while Storm lounged on the counter beside her, his large body now taking up most of the space. The look on Dr. Reyes's face was one of complete shock. He stood frozen, staring at Storm with wide eyes before urgently knocking on Margaret's door. Reluctantly, Margaret invited him in, noticing how his gaze never left Storm, who had retreated to a high perch to observe the stranger. With gentle but serious words, Dr. Reyes explained what Margaret had somehow failed to see. The cat she had rescued and raised with such devotion was no ordinary domestic pet. Storm was a clouded leopard cub, a highly endangered wildcat species native to the forests of Southeast Asia. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this be possible? Dr. Reyes explained that clouded leopards were sometimes smuggled illegally as exotic pets. Someone must have brought Storm into the country and then abandoned him during the storm when they realized the challenges of keeping a wild animal. As the truth sank in, Margaret experienced a wave of conflicting emotions. She felt foolish for not realizing sooner, yet also amazed that she had successfully raised such a rare creature. But most of all, she felt a crushing sense of loss beginning to form as Dr. Reyes gently explained what needed to happen next. Keeping Storm was not only illegal under wildlife protection laws, but would become increasingly dangerous. Clouded leopards grow to be powerful predators with instincts that cannot be domesticated. As he matured, Storm would become less predictable and potentially aggressive, even toward Margaret, whom he clearly bonded with. Dr. Reyes explained that Storm needed specialized care that Margaret simply couldn't provide in her farmhouse. Furthermore, as a member of an endangered species, Storm was valuable to conservation breeding programs that worked to prevent clouded leopards from disappearing forever. Margaret sat quietly, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed this painful reality. Storm had saved her from the emptiness that had threatened to consume her life. He had given her days purpose and joy when she needed it most. Now she needed to save him by letting him go. The decision was the hardest Margaret had faced since losing her husband. But deep down, she knew what was right. With Dr. Reyes's help, arrangements were made for Storm to be transferred to a specialized wildlife sanctuary where he would receive proper care among others of his kind. On the day Storm left, Margaret spent hours just sitting with him, memorizing every detail of the extraordinary creature who had come into her life disguised as a simple kitten needing rescue. When the transport team arrived, she kissed his spotted head one last time before watching them drive away with a piece of her heart. The story didn't end there, though. The wildlife sanctuary, recognizing the special bond between Margaret and Storm, made special arrangements for her to visit regularly. Margaret became an unexpected advocate for endangered species, sharing her unusual story at local schools and community events to educate others about wildlife trafficking and conservation. Though her farmhouse felt emptier in Storm's absence, Margaret's life had been forever changed. She had found purpose beyond loneliness, and her heart remained full, knowing she had made the right choice for the magnificent creature who had needed her, and whom she had needed just as much. And what about you? If you discovered the pet you loved and raised turned out to be a wild animal, could you find the strength to do what was best for them, even if it broke your heart?